Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album, the sophomore album from Starset, called Vessels. Space rock, perhaps one of the oddest subgenres of rock music that I've ever covered on this show. It's never really amassed huge popularity or become widely recognized outside the music scene, mostly because unlike the majority of musical subgenres, the term is more based around subject matter rather than sound. Well, okay, that's not even quite entirely true. Musical tropes like huge waves of synth, muted electronic touches to distort the human presence, and a commitment to gigantic expansive mixes, they tend to crop up, but it's generally used as a catch-all term for music that focuses on science fiction and space. And it's included a surprising breadth of artists, from 70s acts like David Bowie, Pink Floyd, and Hawkwind, to the 90s resurgence among acts like Failure, Flying Saucer Attack, and some albums from the Flaming Lips, to the growth and success of acts as diverse as Star One, Angels and Airwaves, and Muse at one end of quality, and well, 30 Seconds to Mars at the far, far other end. And that's before you factor in the huge number of progressive acts in rock and metal who have helped develop and expand the sound into a very recognizable aesthetic these days. In other words, it should be no surprise that I'm a big fan of this genre, not just because I'm a sci-fi nerd, but also because of a commitment to bombast and big ideas that can be really compelling if well executed. So enter into the scene Starset, an Ohio rock band that wanted to tell those big sci-fi stories with the sort of MIDI-touch cinematic swell that could make for some really potent space rock. Hell, the frontman had a PhD in engineering. He should know this stuff. It should be right up my alley. And yet, unfortunately, the more listens I gave to their debut album Transmissions, the less I liked it. Mostly because the band was a lot less closer to Ayreon and a lot closer to 30 Seconds to Mars and Breaking Benjamin of all people, who they described as their primary influences. And yeah, that definitely shows through in underwritten songs, underwhelming lyrics, and a lot of space rock touches and textures that didn't really have the compositional strength in the melodies or performance to be a lot more memorable for me. Look, I appreciate spacey bombast, but there needs to be some heft in the writing and storytelling for it to really stick with me or rise to among the best in the genre. And thus, when Starset announced they were making their sophomore album Vessels was going a little bit more towards pop instead of heavy metal, well, okay, it wasn't precisely bad. It'd certainly be defining its own unique lane in the subgenre. Hell, it could even work with the more basic lyrical construction and delivery, so okay, I'm on board. How does Vessels turn out? Well, folks, look, I wish I could say I get more into this, but with every listen through the 70 plus minutes of this album, I kept coming back to the fact that this album should be so much more memorable or interesting than it is. Seriously, I'm at a little loss for words here. This sort of space-themed rock music should be right in my alley, right up my wheelhouse. And yet, just like their debut, none of it's sticking with me. A lumbering, overlong, painfully underwritten, and underwhelming behemoth that doesn't have the character or charisma to do more for me. It's literally groaning under its weight of its own cinematic bombast. And yet, the more I dig into all the content, the more all that bombast almost seems like a parody. And yet, I'm not laughing here, I gotta say. Now look, that's a pretty harsh indictment to make, especially coming from a guy who has willingly embraced metal that's far more openly cheesy than this will ever be. But look, my case starts with the production and the instrumentation. Much was made of this album's embracing more pop tendencies in a lot of the production, and while you can definitely see it in some of the buzzier synths and obviously electronic drum machines and beats, this is also an album that wants to incorporate more gent-inspired riffing or growled or scream vocals. Okay, I'm not gonna fault them for diversity, but not only does it make for some whiplash transitions between some of the heavier segments, especially when you factor in orchestral bombast that seems to be integrated behind the perpetual buzz of the mix, or in interludes that add up to a lot less than you would otherwise think, but none of it leads to dramatic or interesting focus on melody. It's actually a little bit alarming how consistently the melodic basis of these hooks feels completely forgotten. It's not like gent riffing is ever going to pick up much actual tune, but you would think that on the hooks they would see fit to give one of the omnipresent synthesizers or thicker riffs more of an actual melody or an interesting progressive shift or a guitar solo anywhere on this album. And for me, the immediate aftermath is that outside the vocal line, I can barely remember any of these songs having any sort of distinctive character at all, not helped by an album that goes a lot longer than it can really sustain, with many songs having these extended outros that actually have more tune than the actual song does. You'd think with more of a pop focus there'd be more of a focus on making these hooks more memorable, but all they seem to get from that category is this gurgling bubble of synth that's more texture than tone, a lot more simple simplified lyrics, and, of course, auto-tune, as if we needed that. So let's take one of the opening tracks, Frequency. Now, does anyone think this sort of gent-esque riffing has the grind and impact of dentist drill, balances well against a more programmed and stiff beat like this? None of which complements any sort of groove, I might add, especially when there's actually a decent synth melody that could have been used to drive this hook. Similar case for Bringing It Down, which, if anything, feels even more choppy. If anything, it feels like songs like Die For You or Telepathic just decide to pick up certain popular modern elements for accents in pop music and do little else, like pitch-shifted vocals and certain synth tones, and then just pile them into a mix that doesn't know how to highlight them well at all or use them more effectively. The best example, probably the lead-off single Monster, with the blubbery synth fuzz and the chunky beat bleeding over a good keyboard line and strings and, an actual groove. But even then, not saying much, especially when you consider the rest of the song, like, the lyrics. Now that said, if I'm gonna find tones or hooks that actually kind of work for me here, well, the buzzy pop grind of Ricochet, that was decent, and I dug the tonal balance on Last to Fall, even if I had the sneaking feeling I could be listening to a mid-period Linkin Park album and getting something a lot better. And you know what? I guess I don't mind the atmospherics of a song like Starlight or Everglow. And again, there are some interesting fast-paced synth cascades that could be a solid foundational melody if the production didn't feel like the drive to bury them in a pile-up of tones and little actual dynamics. The song that probably comes closest to actually coming together is probably Back to Earth, and again, I wouldn't put that song beyond passable in that regard. A big part of this is the vocals from Dustin Bates, and look, I get why some people like his more expressive tones and that he is showing more versatility compared to the debut, but his brand of loud, soft, scream-singing crib from the 3 Days Grace and Breaking Benjamin school just doesn't work for me whatsoever, especially when you can tell that it's piling on the auto-tune and vocal layers and overdubs to give him any kind of presence in the mix. When he's in his softer range, he reminds me of Owl City, which does not fit in with the heavier instrumentation at all, and when he's trying to go harder, look, I'm sorry, maybe this is me coming from space metal or progressive metal acts with a lot more firepower, but square him against the majority of singers on, say, an Ayreon album, and look, he's falling painfully short. But you know what? Those vocals are often emphasized more than any actual instrumental melody, presumably to help emphasize the lyrics, which is a really bad idea because a lot of these lyrics are beyond help. It blows my mind. For as much as Bates references science and astronomy, at least initially, he chooses to completely neuter all the wonder and scope of such big ideas and technological wonders to have them reference a lot of small toxic relationships, failures of communication, and especially on the back half, a whole load of self-loathing cribbed from your average nu metal album. And while I think this is a total waste of the space rock aesthetic in my books, I guess I can kind of see the appeal of taking human drama and inflating it to giant size, which of course would be better achieved with a real sense of crescendo or instrumental dynamics, but whatever. The problem is that the writing feels so much smaller in its ideas and composition and thematic through line than it really should. The metaphors are the most thuddingly obvious when it comes to relating space and science to modern rock radio, and the thematic arc doesn't even touch the big ideas that it could. From what I could glean here, any narrative on this album is thin at best. Despite some miscommunications, the protagonist launches himself after this satellite or object of his affection in the distance, probably a girl, ventures off after an enticing unknown, and then after getting lost, circles back to come crashing down when, filled with a deeper darkness that's now consuming him, he wants to open himself up to the world. And I'm sorry, didn't Vector and In the Woods do something better like this last year? I think the point that he's trying to make about obsession with this sort of thing, but I have a hard time taking it all that seriously considered how broadly sketched and really kind of basic the writing feels. And it really feels like they're squandering a sound that could aim for so much bigger with a lot more interesting themes and ideas. But you know what? The more I thought about this album, the more I came to the sharp realization that this is not intended for me. I mean, it's space rock, should be right up my alley, but this is for modern mainstream rock fans who are looking for something a little bit less cerebral or alien than an Ayreon album, only really using the synth and modern pop touches as garnish to an otherwise very conventional rock approach. And if you can't tell, it's a style of rock music that either feels clumsily mixed, lacking in dynamics or progressive musicianship, and really feels spread too thin to back it all up. And look, I get that Starset as an audience, and hey, good for them. But for me, light 5 out of 10, and I can't really recommend this. Between a lack of consistent melodies, an underwhelming frontman, a lack of decent hooks, and the lingering sense of disappointment that cool ideas didn't pay off more, again, probably not just for me. It happens. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I can imagine this review will prove a little controversial, so I got the poll up here so all you guys can tell me how wrong I am. And I got a link in the description below if you want to support the band and actually buy the record. And if there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get more involved in my scheduling process, the link to my Patreon is right there. For contributors, 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher Patreon contributors, you get to add even albums or movies to my schedule. More details is right in the link over there, but until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.